that person breathing. And now, we turn our program back to our announcer, Don McHugh.
Thank you, gentlemen. Next week at the same time, these three leaders of our major faiths will return to share their knowledge and to offer their help as you face your individual challenge. The many questions which arise in the course of your daily lives can be answered during these discussions. Simply address your queries to Challenge, KOMO-TV, Seattle, Washington. Challenge is produced by Marty Kemp, directed by Ken Ritchie. Join us next week at the same time when Dr. Corson, Rabbi Levine, and Father Tracy again explore the challenges Americans face today. Until then, good night.
Try not to get worried, try not to turn on to problems that upset you. Well, don't you know everything's alright? Yes, everything's fine.
And I think I shall sleep well tonight. Let the world turn without me tonight.
Close your eyes, and forget all about us tonight.
This is the holy city of Jerusalem. At the time of Jesus Christ, the land was called Palestine and included the provinces of Judea, Samaria, and Galilee. The people of Palestine, the Jews, were men of peace and numbered about 3 million. Jerusalem was, and is today, the center of the Jewish world. It was here that the seeds of 3 great religions were nurtured and spread to every corner of the earth: Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. The program is Challenge, an interfaith dialogue featuring a rabbi, a minister, and a priest. Tonight's Challenge, filmed in the Holy Land, features Rabbi Raphael Levine, Rabbi Emeritus of the Temple de Hirsch in Seattle; Dr. Robert Fine, pastor of the First Free Methodist Church of Seattle; and this evening's moderator, Father William Tracy, pastor of the Church of St. Michael's in Olympia, Washington.
The mystery that is Jerusalem, the challenge that is Jerusalem. How to unite the holy, how to echo the divine in the shape of words, in a form of deeds. So writes Abraham Heschel about Jerusalem, the holiest of cities. When dedicating the Temple of Jerusalem some 3,000 years ago, Solomon prayed as follows: when a foreigner who is not of the people of Israel comes from a far country for thy name's sake, when he comes and prays towards this house, hear those in heaven thy dwelling place, and do according to all for which the foreigner calls on thee. Foreigners have come many times to Jerusalem. In the year 70, the Romans came and destroyed the temple. The Crusaders came about the year 1000 and stayed over 100 years. The Turks came in 1517 and stayed until 1917. And now, for the first time in 19 centuries, Jerusalem is again a Jewish city. In front of us, as we look at Jerusalem, is the Dome of the Rock Mosque, built in the year 691 on the site of the temple. The temple, first built by Solomon about 1,000 years before Christ. In the year 587, the Babylonians came down from the north and destroyed the temple and carried the Jews into captivity. They returned in 537 and built a smaller temple. This temple was replaced by a much larger one by Herod about the time of Jesus Christ. To the south of us, about 10 miles away, is the city of Bethlehem, where Christ was born. Bethlehem, though small in size, was well known, because this was the city where David, the first king of the Jews, was born. Perhaps at this time, I should stop and identify for ourselves, according to the Christian belief, the identity of Jesus Christ, who was born in Bethlehem. In the year 325, his followers at the Council of Nicaea threw up this formula of faith in him, that he was born of the Virgin Mary, true God, of the same divine nature as the Father, who for us men and for our salvation became man. Jesus did not grow up, however, in Bethlehem. He grew up in a small city to the north of Jerusalem, up in Galilee, in the town of Nazareth. It's never even mentioned in the Old Testament times. Tradition tells us that Mary conceived Christ at Nazareth. Recently, a magnificent new church was erected on the site of the older church over a spot dear to Christians, where God, in the person of Jesus, became united in a most unique way, in human form, in the person conceived by Mary. Here in Nazareth, as a child, he watched his mother go to the well for water where women still go at Nazareth. He played with children in the streets and went to the synagogue on Saturdays. One of the big events of the year was when the whole family went to Jerusalem for the celebration of the High Holy Days. When he was about 30 years old, Jesus left Nazareth, his hometown, and made his headquarters in the thriving towns along the west coast of the Sea of Galilee. Here, he recruited 11 of the 12 men called apostles, who carried his message to the Roman world, to Rome, to Corinth, to Athens, who were witnesses of his resurrection. The message preached in the towns and in the countryside, on the Mount of the Beatitudes and in Jerusalem, had a recurring theme. A new commandment I give you, love one another. There is no greater love than this, than to lay down one's life for one's friends. Jesus' love and involvement with people led to his tragic death on a cross under circumstances which we shall now recall. We are about to recall the most important and the most dramatic 24 hours in human history. Here, Jesus Christ retired from the city of Jerusalem, where he had celebrated the Passover meal with his followers on the day that Christians call Holy Thursday. Anguish, fear, and loneliness overcame him as he was completely alone here while the disciples slept in the shadow of these olive trees. And then he could see in the distance the lights of people coming to the city to arrest him. Perhaps you could recall for us, Dr. Fine, the details in the scriptures of that arrest.
Gethsemane actually means oil's press. This is the place where the olives were pressed. And here the soul of the master was indeed under tremendous pressure. His disciples were not with him, and he was in agony alone. But perhaps the greatest pressure of all was the fact that he saw this crowd of people coming, and at their head was Judas, one of the apostles. And then Judas came to him and kissed him, which was the signal for them to take him. And then, of course, they gathered around him, and a scuffle ensued, and Jesus told them to put up their sword, that he was not to be taken by violence, that he could be taken any day in the temple like this. And then, of course, they took hold of him, they arrested him, and they led him inside the walled city to the house of the high priest, Caiaphas.
We are now standing in front of the church built on the site of the home of the high priest Caiaphas in the time of Christ. Here he was brought from Gethsemane following his arrest. The church is called St. Peter in Gallicantu, Peter of the Cockcrow, recalling the prophecy of Christ of the previous evening to Peter, before the cock crows twice, you will deny me thrice. Here Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin decided that Christ should be condemned to death. Rabbi, what was the attitude or the understanding of the high priest concerning Christ that they took this attitude at that time?
Well, Father, to the official Jewish authorities, of which the high priest naturally was the leader, religious authorities, Christ's whole attitude and his teaching and some of the things he did, like driving money changers out of the temple, and the money changers, as you know, were in ancient times bankers who took care of the pilgrims who used to come to Jerusalem to exchange their foreign money for Israeli money so that they could buy the things that they wanted to offer as sacrifices during the pilgrim festivals. So from the standpoint of the high priest and the establishment, of course, Jesus was a rebel. He was a subversive. He was a man who was against authority. And therefore, he was a threat to the established people. You see? And so, his attitude toward Jesus would naturally be antagonistic, as would anyone in authority against anyone who tried to destroy the authority. Imagine, Father, what would happen today if somebody came to St. Peter's in Rome while the Pope, for example, was standing on the balcony blessing the people and started a riot by saying that the establishment should be overthrown. Can you imagine the Pope or the authorities would be very happy with a man of that kind? You know very well what happened in the Middle Ages, when even a member of the church, a priest, a monk, dared to criticize some of the doctrines or the authority of the church. A man like Savonarola, who was burned at the stake for heresy. So you have to put yourself in the frame of reference of the people of that time. They didn't realize what Jesus became to the world after Christianity was established. To them, he was just an ordinary individual, an itinerant preacher, not the Son of God that the Christian theology developed and taught about him. So, naturally, to him, Jesus was a threat to the established religious authority. And as a rebel or a threat, he was a subversive. And as a subversive, they weren't as kind with subversives in those days, like we in America are, for example, where we allow them to do almost anything and then give them all the consideration of lawyers and all the other things. So when you understand it in that sense, then you begin to realize a great deal of the New Testament story that is so grievously misunderstood and misinterpreted by ordinary people or those who want to make trouble for Jews.
Well, thank you, Rabbi. We're standing here in front of the church built on the site of the home of the high priest Caiaphas. On this spot, Christ spent his last night on earth, and Rabbi Levine has helped to give us many insights into the role of the high priest in regard to Christ. We shall now go to the Antonia fortress, where the Roman governor Pilate had his residence and where Christ was finally condemned to death. Early on Good Friday, Jesus was taken to the residence of Pilate, the Roman procurator in Jerusalem, located adjacent to the temple. Recent discoveries beneath the convent of the Sisters of Sion have located a huge cistern for water, portions of a Roman arch and cobblestones over which the feet of Christ walked that morning to meet Pilate, who sent him to Herod, who returned him to Pilate. Here Pilate had Jesus scourged by his soldiers. Jewish law exempted those who were to be executed from this terrible ordeal. When the scourging was over and the victim revived with cold water, the Roman soldiers played a game with the prisoner, a sort of king for a day procedure. They made a crown of thorns and placed it on the head of Jesus and mockingly chanted, "Long live the King of the Jews." Finally, in late morning, Pilate gave permission for the crucifixion, and Jesus set out for Calvary, carrying the crosspiece for his own execution. One of the most moving experiences of our recent visit to Jerusalem was the presence of our group at a Mass I offered at a simple altar placed on the cobblestones where Jesus was condemned to death. Dr. Robert Fine read one of the scripture lessons that evening. Rabbi Levine commented on the Gospel of St. Matthew, which describes the choice Pilate gave to the Jews between Jesus and Barabbas. He stated that at Passover time, the Romans granted amnesty to a Jewish prisoner. Pilate gave them a choice between a scourged Jesus and Barabbas. The latter was apparently no common thief, but a guerrilla leader dedicated to the overthrow of Rome, thereby enjoying popular support. The spirit of our presence together on that evening is best indicated by a copper chalice which I used at the service. It was made of olive wood by a Muslim carpenter in Jerusalem, purchased for me by Rabbi Levine. While Muslim, Jew, and Christian differ in answer to the question, who is Christ? Yet I feel, in the unity of spirit we felt that evening, that we were close to the ideals of Christ as manifested in the history of mankind by his life and teaching. We are here in the courtyard of the Franciscan Church, which is built on the site of Herod's palace, the Antonia. It was here that Christ was condemned to death and carried his cross to the place of public execution called Calvary. Most cities of the time of Jesus had a place for public execution, especially of runaway slaves. Jerusalem was no exception. From earliest times, Christians pondering the fate of Christ and its meaning followed in his footsteps, from Pilate's fortress to the place of execution outside the city called Calvary. They called it the Via Dolorosa, the sorrowful road. And when circumstances prevented their coming to Jerusalem, they painted or carved on the walls of their churches scenes which recalled the Via Dolorosa, called the Stations of the Cross. Each Friday afternoon, a public procession takes place along the Via Dolorosa, led by the Franciscans, who have been given official custody of the sacred places. Now, Dr. Fine, Jesus said, "If any man will come after me, let him take up his cross daily and follow me." How do you see the application of these words to day-to-day life for a Christian?
Well, it has a great deal of personal meaning for all Christians, both Catholic and Protestant, because the cross is the meeting place between God and man and between man and man. Here at the cross, all barriers are eliminated. It seems to me that here the suffering love of God is revealed. We see that, as one person said, that Jesus came to take out of the way the things that kept God and man from falling into each other's arms. And then I think that it has within it a great deal of personal responsibility. That is, responsibility, as you stated, to bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Jesus. So walking with you and the rabbi today helps me to feel that we are ready to feel together the hurts of the world. And then there's a personal victory involved here too. The cross points on to victory, the victory that we have, enabling us to lift the burdens of others through the power of Christ and his cross. This is the meaning of it for me.
Well, Rabbi, it was a very moving experience for me this afternoon when you walked beside me on the Via Dolorosa. What were your feelings, may I ask?
Well, it was a very moving experience for me, Father, too. Because to me, the very idea, Via Dolorosa, the way of sorrow, seems to express the condition, the human condition on earth. Here was a man who had a vision. He had an ideal. He tried to impart it to people. They couldn't understand him. Because they couldn't understand him, they were willing to destroy him. And this, to me, was a moving experience. I felt myself really very much in a kindred spirit with this man carrying his cross.
This is part of the Via Dolorosa that Rabbi Levine, Dr. Fine, and myself walked in 1972, which must be very similar, we feel, to what it was like the day that Christ carried his cross. We are standing on the steps of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, built in the 4th century over the place called Calvary, where Christ was crucified. Crucifixion was a Roman form of capital punishment, ordinarily not inflicted on Roman citizens, but intended primarily for slaves. In the early centuries, Christian congregations made up primarily of slaves had an aversion for any vivid portrayal of the crucifixion in their places of worship. Because of the executioner's skill in not severing a vital nerve or artery, a crucified person could survive on the cross for days to finally die of asphyxiation and dehydration. Christ survived for 3 hours. The lifeless body was placed in the tomb on that Friday afternoon. The tomb is now inside this church, dear to Roman Catholics, Greek Orthodox, Armenians, and all Christians. On the following Sunday morning, his followers found the tomb empty, and in various places and by various people, he was seen alive and talked with them, giving them unshakable faith in the fact that he had triumphed over death, a faith they were to preach as the good news to the whole world. What does this tomb mean to you, Dr. Fine?
Well, the tomb is very significant to us, and I would say that this place is sacred to me. It's sacred because it seems to be quite authentic. The place has been preserved for a long period of time and under the jurisdiction of the church. But there is another place that is also very meaningful, and it is called the Garden Tomb. Here you see the stone is rolled away from the stone cave, and you can actually enter the tomb. Somehow I feel like it must have been like that. The natural beauty of this garden speaks to us of new life. It speaks of hope. It speaks of resurrection. Not far away from that site is the Gordon's Calvary. It's a skull-shaped hill called Golgotha. When I visited here in 1964, I struggled about which place might be the authentic place. And I can recall that my guide was a Christian Arab. And when I talked to him about my struggle, he said, don't struggle over it. It really isn't important. The important thing is that he is not here, that he is alive. Of course, this is really what we're concerned about, the great truth of the resurrection, the fact of the new birth of life and hope for the future. And this is the very heart of our faith, belief in the resurrection.
Well, Rabbi, this church is called the Church of the Resurrection in the Greek tradition because it speaks of life more than of death. What is the Jewish position in regard to life after death?
Well, as you know, Father, the concept of resurrection was one of the cardinal principles of the Pharisees. And they believed that when the Messiah will come, that the dead will rise from their graves and the kingdom of God will be ushered in upon earth. Jews have always believed in immortality, and they expressed it, of course, in different ways. But they all believed that death on earth is not the end of existence, that it is merely a transition from one form of life to another. And they have a beautiful expression, because in Judaism learning is growing. So they call life here on earth the yeshiva shalmata, the prep school. And they call the life beyond this life on earth as the yeshiva shalmala, the university, where the body or the person freed from the limitations of the flesh enters into the fullness of his life and fulfills what the phrase created in the image of God means, reflecting the image of God in which he was created.
Well, thank you, Rabbi. Christians agree that the resurrection of Jesus from the dead is the cornerstone of their faith, the essence of the good news about Christ. And as you can see from Rabbi Levine's remarks, both Jews and Christians are brothers in hope, awaiting that better life to come that transcends our physical death. How do we relate the death of Christ to the events of 1972? Could Christ be crucified in the United States, for example, in 1972? Who crucified Christ? It is only fitting that here in the garden where he was arrested, that we recall an event that took place in a certain city in the eastern part of the United States last year on Good Friday, the anniversary day that Christians recall Christ's death. Priests and people began with a procession to the downtown district, to one of the poorest areas of the city. And there a priest made this statement: in buildings as you see around you, unscrupulous landlords condemn Christ to death by charging high rents for poor, inadequate housing, which results in poor education, poor health care, and exploitation by dope pushers and by gamblers. The procession then went to the downtown business section with its large office buildings, where so many times a profit motive that guided policy at the expense of the environment, at the expense of human dignity and of justice. The last scene took place before the city morgue, where a prayer was recited for a derelict who had died that day on the Skid Road, the victim of alcoholism and neglect by society. And the service concluded with these words of Jesus: as long as you did it for one of my least brothers, you did it for me. What is our responsibility for slums and the exploitation of human beings, for indifference to the environment and human values, for crime and its victims, for war and its tragic consequences? And the answer to these questions is the answer to the question, who crucified Christ? For remember, he said, as long as you did it for one of these, my least brothers, you did it for me.